Imagine spending your entire life traveling to a new world. Your parents made the journey. Your grandparents made the journey. 40 generations before you made the journey. And when you finally arrive, when the computers wake the arrival crew and the external cameras blink on for the first time in 200 years, you see lights. Not stars, not the dim glow of volcanic vents or bioluminescent oceans. Lights, grids of them, sprawling across the night side of a planet that was supposed to be empty. Geometric, artificial, impossible. The mission was planned for 1,000 years. The target was chosen because every telescope, every spectral analysis, every long-range probe confirmed it. No technological civilization, no satellites, no radio signals. A sterile world with water and oxygen, waiting. The contract was clear. But someone is already there. The view screens show cities where there should be wilderness, infrastructure where there should be rock. No one on the ship knows who built them or how long they've been there. But when they turned their instruments on the surface, the readings made no sense at all. The heat signatures are wrong. Concentrated power grids, industrial output, thermal bloom consistent with fusion reactors or something denser. The atmospheric composition has shifted since the last probe passed through 600 years ago. More CO2, then less. Stabilized. Radar picks up structures that weren't in the original surveys, not ruins, active. Thousands of them, some over 2 kilometers tall, clustered along coastlines and river valleys. Synthetic aperture scans show movement, traffic patterns, the geometric sprawl of agriculture. The Arrival Council locks down the observation deck. They cycle through every instrument twice, checking for malfunction, cosmic ray corruption, some glitch in the hibernation computers that might have spat out a hallucination. Every sensor confirms the same thing. They are not alone. Someone suggests sending a transmission. Someone else asks what they would even say. A third voice, older, asks a worse question. What if they already know we're here? And that was when someone admitted the terrifying thing. No one still alive truly remembered why they were here. The lights changed everything, but the mission brief still exists. It's in the ship's archive, locked behind protocols no one has needed to touch for 30 generations. Most of the crew knows the outline. The myth version, Earth was dying, or crowded, or humanity needed a backup. They were sent to colonize. That part is solid. But the details have blurred. Was the planet guaranteed empty, or just probable? Was first contact protocol ever discussed? Did the founders know something might happen in 1,000 years? And if so, what did they plan for it? The oral history has gaps. The educators taught what they were taught, and every retelling wore the edges smooth. Earth itself is folklore now. Some of the crew still celebrate the old holidays, more out of tradition than belief. Others openly doubt it was ever real, that the whole story is just a control mechanism to keep people obedient in a closed metal world. The idea that anyone back there still exists, still cares, still remembers this ship, feels like a children's story. So when the council finally agrees they need to open the sealed records, they realize none of them can read the founder's script. The encryption is older than the current language. The biometrics are keyed to people 900 years dead. Their only hope of answers lay behind a door no living person could read. The archive sat in a pressurized vault, 3 decks below the main habitat ring. Its outer casing bore symbols in a typeface no longer used, warnings etched in alloys that predated the current metallurgy standards. The crew had passed it countless times, treating it like ceremonial ballast, a relic too sacred to disturb. Inside, the storage medium had degraded in ways the founders never anticipated. Magnetic strips had demagnetized. Optical discs had developed microfractures from thermal cycling over centuries. The backup systems, designed for 500 years, had been running for twice that long. What survived existed in fragments, partial logs, corrupted video files that played 11 seconds before dissolving into static. Technical manuals with entire chapters missing, their data scattered across failing memory cells. The crew could see that something had been recorded, but most of it was already gone. The few intact files they recovered were all dated within a 90-day window, 6 months before launch. Every document carried the same header, a designation that appeared in no current database. Whatever was inside began with a promise made 1,000 years before any of them were born. The oldest surviving recording lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. A woman in a grey jumpsuit stood in front of a half-assembled hull section, welders sparking in the background. She wasn't reading from notes. Her voice was steady, deliberate, the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this alone. She spoke directly to descendants she'd never meet, explained that the ship carried 14,200 people, genetic diversity calculated to sustain a viable population across 40 generations, that the destination star had 3 planets in the habitable zone, spectroscopy confirmed, that everything they needed to rebuild civilization was in the cargo bays and the gene banks and the digital libraries. Then she said something that didn't fit the rest, that if they arrived and the systems had failed, if the knowledge had been lost, they should remember one thing. The founders hadn't sent them to survive, they'd sent them to arrive. The recording cut off mid-sentence, corrupted at the frame level, but the timestamp was clear. It was made 14 days before the ship left Earth's orbit, when the crew were already in cryo and the final supply runs were complete. It all traced back to a single decision made on a dying deadline back on Earth. Earth had 11 years. That was the consensus window, the point where cascading climate failures would make the planet unrecoverable for large-scale human habitation. They had the technology to build 1-generation ship, maybe 2 if they stripped every orbital factory and repurposed every launch facility. The math was brutal. A ship that could carry 14,200 people required 830,000 tons of material, 6 years to construct, and consumed the entire annual output of 14 countries. Launching 2 ships meant cutting the population of each in half, reducing genetic diversity below the safety threshold. They built The selection process took 9 months. They prioritized genetic health, skill distribution, psychological resilience under confinement, and age. Most of the crew were under 30. They'd spend their entire lives in transit, raise children who'd do the same, become ancestors to people who'd walk on alien soil. The founders knew they were sending a population to drift for 1,000 years through interstellar space, with no support, no resupply, no possibility of rescue. They built redundancy into every system, packed 3 times the spare parts projections demanded, and buried the most critical knowledge in the deepest vaults. There was one number none of them could escape, and it reframed everything. 1,000 years, 40 generations born, raised, and buried in the same metal corridors. The crew who sealed the airlocks would be mythology to the crew who opened them again. Every child born on that ship inherited a destination they'd never see. The engineers who maintained the fusion core in year 247 had never walked under open sky. The teachers who passed down Earth's history in year 683 taught from archives, not memory. 10 centuries is longer than the printing press has existed. It's twice the age of the United States. It's the span between the Viking longships and the Apollo program, compressed into a single unbroken voyage with no port, no landmark, no reference point, but the slow shift of distant stars. The founders built for that scale. They modeled social drift, linguistic evolution, the half-life of institutional knowledge. They planned for 14 generations of redundancy in the genetic database and 8 layers of backup for navigation. But what nobody aboard understood was that the universe behind them never stopped changing. The ship left Earth in 2347 with the best propulsion humanity could build. Fusion engines, 0.12 c cruise velocity, a trajectory locked to a star 117 light-years out. The onboard computers held every scientific paper published before departure, every engineering standard, every cultural record the selection committee deemed essential. What those computers didn't hold was anything published after launch day. No breakthroughs in materials science from 2390. No revised physics from the Titan array experiments in 2461. No new propulsion theory. No medical advances. No agricultural techniques developed in the 8 centuries while the ship coasted through the void. The crew trained their children on 2347 textbooks. They repaired systems with 2347 tools. They solved problems with 2347 knowledge, while the civilization they left behind kept building, kept iterating, kept learning. The gap widened every year. By year 600 of the voyage, Earth had working quantum drives. By year 820, they'd solved the radiation shielding problem that still killed 11% of the ship's population over their lifetimes. The passengers had no way to know any of it. To understand those lights on the horizon, we have to rewind all the way to the launch. 2347. Earth's population had just crossed 14 billion. The Sahara reclamation was 30 years complete. The orbital ring carried 4,000 tons of cargo daily, and the first true AI had been running for 6 months without a single alignment incident. Humanity had solved the crises that mattered. The generation ship wasn't born from desperation. It was ambition, carefully planned over 40 years. They selected the crew from 340,000 applicants. They built the hull in lunar orbit, using asteroid steel. They packed embryo banks, seed vaults, fabrication modules, and a closed-loop biosphere that had run stable in simulation for 18 years. Launch day was April 14, 2347. 50,000 people watched from the observation platforms as the ship's engines lit. It accelerated for 97 days, then went silent, coasting at 36,000 kilometers per second toward a G-type star with 3 confirmed terrestrial planets. The message banks held 10,000 hours of video from families left behind. They knew it was one way. They knew the people who arrived wouldn't remember Earth as a place, only as a story. But they believed in the math, the engineering, the training. The reason they gambled everything came down to a discovery that changed what was possible. In 2187, the orbital array picked up a spectral signature 37 light-years out. Oxygen, water vapor, a stable G-type star. The readings held for 8 months of confirmation sweeps. They called it Kepler 442d. The models gave it a 73% habitability score, higher than anything humanity had ever found. The announcement went live on every network, every feed, every city screen. What they didn't broadcast was the distance. 37 light-years meant 350 trillion kilometers. At the speeds chemical rockets could manage, the trip would take 900,000 years. The public saw hope. The engineers saw a clock ticking down on Earth's biosphere and a destination they had no way to reach, because no rocket ever built could solve the one problem standing in the way. Physics doesn't negotiate. The speed of light is 299,792 kilometers per second, and nothing with mass can touch it. Even at 10% light speed, a velocity no human engine had ever approached, the journey to Kepler 442d would take 370 years. The fastest probe humanity had launched, Voyager 1, was moving at 17 kilometers per second. At that rate, reaching the target system would require 630,000 years. Fusion drives, ion thrusters, antimatter concepts all still measured the crossing in centuries. You can't freeze a crew for 400 years. Cryonics remained theoretical, tissue damage unsolved. You can't ask volunteers to die en route and hope their children's children finish the mission. Except, that's exactly what the proposal said. The engineering teams stopped asking how to make the ship faster. They started asking how to make it last. So they stopped trying to travel faster and started trying to build a world that could move. A generation ship isn't a vessel, it's a closed ecosystem with an engine attached. The design called for 12 kilometers of rotating habitats, agricultural decks under full-spectrum grow lights, water reclamation at 99.7% efficiency, and enough genetic diversity to avoid collapse over 15 generations. The hull would be 3 meters of layered shielding, aluminum, polyethylene, water tanks. Cosmic radiation in interstellar space delivers 0.6 sieverts per year, 120 times Earth's background. Without shielding, the crew would face cancer, neurological damage, sterility. Propulsion was the easy part. A deuterium helium-3 fusion engine could sustain 0.01 grams acceleration for decades, reaching 4.5% light speed. The trajectory was locked in before launch. No course corrections, no abort, no rescue. The ship would carry 1,500 people into the dark, birth 15 generations in transit, and deliver the 16th to a world none of the founders would ever see. The hard part wasn't the engine. It was keeping people alive inside a sealed can. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a pocket biosphere, a closed loop where every molecule of air, water, and food had to cycle forever. Algae tanks pulled CO2 from the breath of 1,500 people and pushed oxygen back. Grey water ran through filters, UV scrubbers, and microbial beds until it was clean enough to drink again. Food came from hydroponic racks stacked 12 levels high, lit by LEDs tuned to photosynthesis peaks at 450 and 660 nanometers. Tilapia bred in tanks fed by plant runoff. Human waste composted in reactors that broke it down to nitrates the crops could use. The system was elegant, borrowed from decades of Mars habitat prototypes and ISS life support, scaled up to feed a town. But elegant didn't mean forgiving. A fungal bloom could choke the hydroponic lines. A pump failure could starve the algae of CO2 and let oxygen levels drop. One contaminated batch of seed stock, one miscalculated harvest, and the calorie budget for 6 months evaporates. It all balanced on a razor's edge that a single leak could shatter. The engineers built spreadsheets that tracked every gram. The algae consumed 2.3 kilograms of CO2 per person per day and produced 1.8 kilograms of oxygen. The hydroponics needed 940 liters of water in circulation at any time, losing 2% weekly to evaporation and plant uptake that had to be reclaimed from the air. Each person ate 2,200 calories daily, which meant 3.3 million calories across the ship every single day, grown inside 780 square meters of cultivation space. The margin was 8%. If disease took 9% of the crops, if a heat exchanger failed and raised temps enough to stress the algae, if a solar panel degraded faster than modeled and cut power to the UV sterilizers, the buffer vanished. They built redundancy into every system, triple backups on air scrubbers, seed vaults in cold storage, spare pumps in every module. But redundancy only bought time. A closed system doesn't forgive. On Earth, if a farm fails, you plant another. On the ship, if the loop breaks, 1,500 people suffocate or starve in the dark, 4.3 light-years from anyone who could help. And before any of that mattered, someone had to decide who would even go. Selection took 4 years. They needed structural engineers who could weld in zero-G, agronomists who understood closed-loop hydroponics, doctors trained in surgery without resupply. But skills weren't enough. Psychologists screened for patience, conflict resolution, the ability to stay sane in a metal tube for decades. One explosive personality could fracture a community with no exit. Then came genetics. The crew couldn't all be Swedish or Han Chinese or Yoruba. They needed diversity, not for politics, but for survival, immune systems that could handle different pathogens. Recessive genes spread thin enough that cousins 6 generations out wouldn't carry the same lethal mutations. The geneticists built family trees forward in time, simulating 500 years of births, checking for bottlenecks, for inbreeding coefficients that crept too high. They recruited from 43 countries, husband and wife teams, siblings, a few multi-generational families who volunteered as blocks. Some came for adventure, some for faith, some because Earth felt used up. Every applicant knew they'd never see the destination. Their great-great-great-grandchildren might fall below one specific number, and the whole population would slowly collapse from within. The math was brutal. 500 people sounds like plenty, but geneticists ran the numbers and found something darker. With that few founders, you'd see cousin marriages by generation 3, recessive disorders surfacing by generation 5, and a slow genetic collapse by generation 10. The minimum viable population turned out to be around 14,000 to 40,000 individuals, depending on how strict you wanted the genetic diversity targets. Most mission architects settled on 20,000 as the floor. That meant launching a city, not a crew. But here's what the models couldn't predict. Even with 20,000 carefully selected genomes, populations drift. Random chance means some alleles vanish, others dominate. Over 30 generations in isolation, you're not preserving Earth's gene pool, you're creating something new. Every one of them had to sign a compact that would bind people not yet born. The Founders' Compact was 147 pages of legal architecture written by people who'd never lived to see it tested. It laid out governance structures, resource allocation protocols, mandatory education standards, and reproductive guidelines. It was a constitution for a country that didn't exist yet. Clause 12 required every adult to contribute to ship maintenance. Clause 47 mandated genetic counseling before conception. Clause 89 forbade religious or ideological movements that rejected the mission itself. The signers understood they were writing rules for strangers. The compact included sunset provisions, amendment procedures, and emergency powers for the Command Council. It tried to balance stability with flexibility, knowing that rigidity kills and chaos kills faster. But every clause rested on one assumption, that distant descendants would honor promises their ancestors made. Which raised a question no founder could answer. What about the children who never chose this? You're born in year 487. The walls have always been gray metal. The stars don't move. Your parents explain you're traveling to a planet you'll never see, fulfilling a mission you never agreed to. You can't leave. There is no leave. Philosophers called it the consent paradox. The first generation volunteered, but their children inherited a prison sentence. Your grandparents signed a contract on your behalf before you existed. Every decision about your life, from your education to your career to whether you could have children, traced back to a document drafted centuries ago by strangers. Some mission planners argued it wasn't different from any society. No child chooses their country, their language, their laws. But most countries let you leave. Most countries don't require you to spend your entire life maintaining the vehicle your great-grandparents bought. The founders' answer was to teach a home their grandchildren would never see. Every child born on the ship would attend classes in modules repurposed from crew quarters. The curriculum wasn't optional. Math, physics, biology, engineering, Earth history, literature from 6 continents. Teachers rotated through subjects they'd been trained for during the 14-year construction phase, passing down not just formulas, but the reasons humanity had reached for the stars. Language preservation became its own discipline. English was the working tongue, but archives held Mandarin, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic. The founders knew that losing a language meant losing the way a culture thought. So kids learned vocabulary for snow in 47 dialects, recipes their ancestors cooked, songs sung at weddings they'd never attend. But knowledge isn't static. A biologist who learned from textbooks can't answer the questions her students ask 40 years later. A historian teaching the fall of Rome has never walked through ruins or felt Mediterranean sun. Each generation would be one step further from the sensory truth of Earth, teaching abstractions of abstractions. The founders built the system knowing this. They recorded lectures, digitized museums, packed 18,000 hours of Earth footage. They hoped repetition and ritual would keep the mission alive in young minds. Everything rested on a library built to survive 1,000 years. The ship's archive occupied 12 decks near the core, shielded from radiation by 4 meters of water and regolith. It held 340 petabytes across 9 redundant storage formats: magnetic tape, optical discs, crystalline lattices that encoded data in synthetic DNA. If 3 formats failed, 6 remained. Every file existed in triplicate, distributed across separate vaults. Maintenance protocols required monthly integrity checks, with automated repair bots rewriting degraded sectors. The system was designed so that even if a generation forgot how it worked, the next could rediscover the manuals and bring it back online. But redundancy assumes someone remembers to check. The archive included operating systems, but those systems would become obsolete. It held instructions in English, but English would drift. A word like cloud meant weather in 2187, then data storage, then maybe something else by 2687. The engineers knew this too. They'd seen ancient texts misread, religious scriptures reinterpreted, technical manuals turned into myth, so they encoded the simplest knowledge in symbols, math, universal constants. They built a library that could teach itself to a civilization that had forgotten how to read. Then came the day that split humanity into those who left and those who stayed. The ship launched on August 9, 2187, under a sky crowded with satellites and farewell broadcasts. 11,247 people strapped into acceleration couches as fusion engines ignited, pushing the vessel to 0.02 C over 18 months. Earth's orbital stations recorded every second. Families on the ground watched their children leave the planet forever. The first week was silence and nausea. Then the engines throttled down to cruise thrust, and people unbuckled, floating through corridors they'd only seen in Sims. They planted the first seeds in hydroponics, activated the algae reactors, tested the water recyclers. The ship smelled like metal and overworked air scrubbers. Messages from Earth took 6 hours to arrive by year 3, then 14, then 29. Video calls became letters, became silence. The last transmission from Mission Control came in 2201, a bureaucratic update on asteroid mining policy. After that, the void. On the ship, the crew settled into a routine that would define 40 generations. They named their children, elected councils, built traditions in the narrow world of the hull. They believed the plan was locked, the trajectory fixed, the destination certain. Back home, something happened that no one aboard could have predicted. Earth's labs didn't shut down the day the ship launched. Physicists kept running simulations, engineers kept testing prototypes, and funding kept flowing into propulsion research that had suddenly become less theoretical. Within 20 years, a team in Geneva demonstrated a fusion drive with 4 times the exhaust velocity of the generation ship's ion arrays. By year 50, a scaled prototype achieved continuous thrust at 0.15 grams for 90 days. The math was obvious to anyone who cared to run it. A ship launched in 2150 with the new drive could overtake the generation ship halfway to its destination, arriving decades earlier with a crew that aged only 30 years. The press called it the tortoise problem. The engineers called it inevitable. No one sent word to the ship. The message delay was already 6 months each way, and what would they say? Meanwhile, aboard the ship, the first generation settled into a strange and rigid new normal. The founders treated those early decades like a boot camp that would never end. Every rotation was logged, every gram of waste tracked, every conflict mediated through elected councils that met in the hydroponics bay under grow lights. They held classes in the library module 6 days a week, teaching their children orbital mechanics, genetic diversity calculations, and the history of 14 failed closed ecosystems on Earth. The curriculum had been written by exobiologists and child psychologists, and it showed. There were songs about nitrogen cycling. Work assignments rotated every 90 days, so no one became irreplaceable. Meals were communal, timed to the ship's arbitrary 24-hour clock. They celebrated Earth holidays for the first 15 years, then started inventing their own, small rituals tied to maintenance milestones and harvest yields. The founders believed discipline and transparency would carry them through. They published resource projections in the mess hall, held open votes on everything from air mix ratios to funeral protocols. It felt like building something. Their daily routines were about to calcify into unbreakable law. By year 18, the Council of Stewards had drafted the Hull Compact, a 47-page document that governed everything from water rations, 41 liters per person per week, to the penalties for tampering with life support. It wasn't voted on. It was ratified by consensus after 9 months of debate in sessions that everyone attended because there was nowhere else to be. The compact instituted shift bells, waste audits, and mandatory arbitration for interpersonal disputes. It created the role of keeper, a rotating position responsible for maintaining the knowledge archive and teaching the next generation. It formalized the birth lottery, the crop calendar, and the inspection schedule for hull seals. Most importantly, it established that no one could override a life support decision without unanimous council approval, and that the ship's trajectory was locked by design, inaccessible even to the engineering crew. The founders had watched Earth's history. They knew how fragile consensus could be in a closed system. The rules worked. Algae yields stayed stable, the air stayed breathable, and no one starved. The ship hummed through the dark, its 8,000 tons of metal and carbon fiber holding 312 lives in equilibrium. Then came the first birth aboard, and the first human who never chose the stars. They named her Maya, born 9 months and 11 days after launch, 3.2 kilograms, healthy lungs that filled with recycled air for the first time in human history. Her parents were both structural engineers, both volunteers, both 29 when they boarded. Maya would never feel rain. She'd never see a horizon that wasn't a bulkhead 40 meters away. The founders had prepared for this intellectually, but watching her tiny fingers curl around theirs made it real in a way the training simulations hadn't. By year 2, there were 7 shipborne children. By year 5, there were 23. They learned to crawl in 0.3 g spin gravity, their legs adapting to a force Earth's children would find impossibly light. They pointed at stars through the observation ports and asked which one was home, and their parents pointed to a dim yellow dot already 2.1 light-years behind them. The founders started noticing small things, how the children ran differently, their gaits evolved for curved floors, how they instinctively understood 3-dimensional navigation through the rotating habitats in ways the Earthborn had to consciously learn. Watching that child grow, the founders understood their descendants would become strangers. The compact had assumed continuity, shared purpose passing cleanly from one generation to the next, like a baton in a relay race that would run for 40 generations. But Maya and the others wouldn't remember the night sky over Earth, wouldn't recall the weight of a full G pressing down, wouldn't carry any lived memory of the world they were sailing toward. By year 8, psychologists were documenting what they called referential drift. The shipborne kids used Earth metaphors differently. Ocean meant the water recycling tanks. Forest meant the hydroponics bays. Outside meant the hull corridors, not the vacuum beyond. The founders had uploaded 847 terabytes of Earth culture, but data isn't memory. You can watch 1,000 hours of waves crashing and never know what salt spray tastes like. The third generation would be even further removed, their parents' second-hand stories becoming myths, then abstractions. Mission planners had modeled genetic diversity, caloric requirements, oxygen budgets. They'd built redundancy into every system, double-checked every calculation. But no one had stress-tested whether people 600 years from launch would still care about a destination their great-great-great-great-grandparents chose. And then something failed that the blueprints never accounted for. Year 11, day 73. A coolant pump in reactor section B seized without warning. Temperature spiked 18 degrees Celsius in 4 minutes before automated safeties kicked in and scrammed the reactor. The ship had 3 redundant reactors, so power stayed stable, but half the living modules lost heat for 6 hours, while engineers rerouted the thermal grid. The pump had been rated for 50 years of continuous operation. It failed at 11. Post-mortem showed a manufacturing defect, a microscopic stress fracture in the impeller that Earthside quality control had missed. It was exactly the kind of failure the ship's triple redundancy was designed to absorb. What the engineers noticed afterward was harder to quantify. During those 6 cold hours, 2 families in the affected modules demanded immediate relocation to warmer sections. When told the rotation schedule was fixed to maintain population balance, one father, a founder, a man who'd scored in the 97th percentile for mission commitment, said he didn't care about the schedule. He cared about his daughter staying warm. The repair took 11 days. The arguments about resource allocation, about who deserved priority when systems failed, lasted 6 months. Factions formed along family lines, then professional guilds, then residential modules. The compact had outlined decision-making procedures for technical failures. It hadn't outlined what happens when people stop trusting the procedures. But the real threat wasn't in the machinery. It was in the people. The hydroponic sensors worked. The reactor held steady. The navigation system kept them on course, adjusting thrust every 72 hours, like it had for decades. Nothing in the machinery had failed. But the second generation wasn't breaking down over faulty equipment. They were breaking down over the mission itself. Kids who grew up inside steel walls, who'd never felt wind or seen a horizon, started asking why they were here, not how the ship worked, why any of this mattered. The founders had signed up, their children hadn't. Every shift in the algae farms, every maintenance rotation, every rule about water rations and curfew felt like a sentence they'd inherited. The older crew had purpose. The younger ones had orders. Arguments in the mess hall got sharper. Maintenance logs went unsigned. A few teenagers refused their shift assignments outright. And when the shift supervisors tried to enforce them, they were met with a question that had no protocol response. One question began spreading through the decks, and it had no easy answer. Why are we doing this? Not as philosophy, as demand. The shipborne wanted to know why they had to spend their entire lives maintaining a voyage to a planet they'd never see, for people who didn't exist yet. Some of the founders tried explaining, "We're carrying humanity forward. We're the bridge between Earth and a new world." But those answers didn't land anymore. The second generation had no memory of Earth, no attachment to the idea of it. They hadn't chosen this. A 19-year-old engineer named Kara put it plainly during a crew meeting in year 47. "We didn't agree to this mission. You did. Why should we die for your dream?" The room went silent. No one had a rebuttal that didn't sound like coercion. The mission had always assumed continuity, that each generation would accept the purpose passed down to them, that duty would inherit itself. But duty doesn't work like genetics, and once the question was out loud, it couldn't be pulled back. So those in charge did the only thing they thought could save the mission. They tightened their grip. The council, now mostly original crew in their 60s and 70s, started drafting new policies. Mandatory mission education for anyone under 30. Reassignments for anyone deemed non-essential or disruptive. A formal code that made refusing a shift assignment a violation punishable by reduced rations or confinement. They framed it as protecting the ship, keeping everyone safe, but it read like control. The younger crew weren't just being managed anymore, they were being contained, and the more the leadership pushed, the more resistance hardened. Some of the second generation formed what they called study groups, meeting in the lower decks to talk through what the mission actually meant, whether it could be renegotiated, whether they owed anything to a destination centuries away. The council called them dissidents, logged their names, started monitoring who attended. By year 52, the ship had something it was never designed to carry: enforced belief. You didn't just have to work, you had to believe the work mattered. And if you didn't, there were now mechanisms to make you comply. The hardest rule of all was the one that governed who could be born. The quota was set at 0.8 children per adult, recalculated every 5 years against food yields and oxygen capacity. Couples applied to the population committee months in advance. If your sector was over allocation, you waited. Medical staff administered contraceptive implants at age 14. Removal required a permit signed by 3 officials. Unauthorized pregnancy meant termination or exile to the lowest deck, where rations dropped to 1,200 calories. One woman hid her pregnancy until month 6, stitching her jumpsuit looser each week. They found her during a hull inspection. The baby was born in quarantine and reassigned to a family with clearance. Parents who lost a child to illness couldn't reapply for 2 years. The waiting list stretched to 140 names, and everything would change the day the last of the original founders died. Dr. Helena Voss died at 91, 68 years into the voyage. She'd been chief engineer at launch, the woman who'd signed off on the reactor shielding and written the first maintenance schedules by hand. They held the funeral in the main hall. 2,000 people attended, most of them born aboard. They'd never seen Earth, never felt rain, but they watched recordings of her walking through mission control in 2187. She looked impossibly young. She looked like she believed. The third generation asked questions the recordings couldn't answer. What did launch day smell like? How did you choose who came? Why did you think we'd make it? Voss had stopped giving interviews at year 52, too tired to repeat herself. They cremated her in the recycler, as regulations required. Her ashes went into the composting system. Within 6 months, her carbon would feed the hydroponic wheat. And with that death, the ship lost something no archive had ever recorded. The manuals covered procedures, not judgment. They explained how to replace a coolant valve, but not when a hiss meant you had 10 seconds or 10 hours. Voss used to walk the lower decks every morning, listening. She'd stop at junction 12C, press her palm to the wall, and call maintenance before the sensor alarms triggered. The new engineers read her notes. Vibration pattern suggests bearing wear, Sector 4 pump assembly. They couldn't hear what she'd heard. 2 months after her death, a pump seized. It took them 11 hours to diagnose, 14 to repair. The greenhouse lost pressure for 6 hours. Other knowledge vanished the same way. The mycologist who knew which fungal blooms were safe, which would spread. The machinist who could feel a lathe's balance through his fingertips. The cook who stretched rations through 9 lean months by instinct. No formula. They'd trained apprentices, but training wasn't the same as 60 years of mistakes survived. The second generation knew the words. The third generation read the manuals and hoped the margins held no secrets. Into that fragile silence, a signal arrived from home. The transmission took 112 days to reach them. Earth announced a prototype drive capable of 18% light speed, tested successfully in lunar orbit. A follow-up mission could reach the destination in 340 years. The bridge crew ran the math twice. If Earth launched within 20 years, the new ship would overtake them at year 380, arrive first, and establish the colony before the original crew even entered final approach. The entire sacrifice would be rendered obsolete. Only 9 people aboard had the physics background to fully understand the report. The chief engineer printed a single hard copy and carried it to the captain's quarters. They spoke for 47 minutes behind a sealed door. No announcement was made at morning assembly. The data packet was moved to a restricted partition, flagged maintenance only, password sealed. The printed copy went into an incinerator. Instead of celebrating, leadership quietly made the message disappear. The official log recorded the transmission as routine systems telemetry. Captain's notes justified the suppression in 4 careful paragraphs. Morale was fragile, the hydroponics failure still fresh in memory. Knowledge of a faster ship would corrode purpose, breed resentment, fracture the social contract that kept 8,200 people functional in 11 kilometers of corridor. 3 of the 9 who'd seen the data argued for disclosure. 1 was reassigned to waste reclamation. Another accepted the logic after a long night in the observation deck. The third began keeping a private journal, hidden in a maintenance shaft behind panel J447. Word leaked anyway. Not the technical details, but the shape of it. A betterment, a second chance, something held back. Within 6 weeks, rumors moved through the lower decks like a slow fire, each retelling adding distortion, speculation, accusation. The council issued a formal denial, citing disinformation and stress-induced paranoia. They tightened information access, instituted random audits of personal files, reminded everyone that survival depended on unity. The more they denied, the more people believed. It was the first crack in a trust that would never fully heal. Conversations in the mess halls grew quieter, eyes tracking who sat with whom. Parents stopped bringing children to the captain's addresses. Maintenance requests went unanswered for weeks, not from negligence but from a creeping disengagement, a sense that the rules were no longer mutual. Anonymous graffiti appeared in Sector 7. They knew. It was painted over within hours. 2 days later, it reappeared in Sector 3, Sector 12, Sector 19. Security couldn't track the source. Each erasure seemed to spawn 3 more. The chaplain reported a 40% drop in weekly gatherings. When asked why, attendees offered vague answers about shift changes and fatigue. The real reason was unspoken but shared. If leadership could bury a message from Earth, what else had been hidden? What other compromises, shortcuts, failures had been quietly archived? In the lower agricultural decks, a new phrase took hold: "We're the ones they left behind." It didn't refer to Earth, it referred to the people 4 levels up, the ones who still believed the mission was sacred, who still read the founders' speeches before bed. By now, even the way they spoke had started to change. The children born in year 107 never called it a corridor. They said, "the hollow." The word Earth became the old ground, then just ground, even though none of them had ever stood on soil. The maintenance logs from that era are harder to read, not because the handwriting changed, but because the vocabulary did. Technical terms eroded first. Coolant manifold became cold line. Atmospheric scrubber became the breathing wall. By year 220, crew members were writing repair notes that engineers 2 generations earlier wouldn't have understood without a dictionary. The ship's central computer still spoke the founders' English, but fewer people could pass its warnings without help. New words emerged for things Earth never had. Deckborn meant someone conceived and raised in 0G sections. Spin fever described the nausea some felt moving between rotating and non-rotating modules. Wallsick was the vertigo that struck when you realized the horizon curved up, not down. The linguists who'd planned the mission had anticipated drift over centuries. They hadn't anticipated it would take 40 years. But the deeper changes weren't in their words, they were in their bodies. The medical bay started logging anomalies around year 195. Bone density 11% below baseline in anyone under 30. Vision degradation in 34% of the population, even with genetic screening that should have prevented it. The gravity in the rotating sections was calibrated to 0.9 G, close enough to Earth that it shouldn't have mattered. It mattered. Radiation was the silent problem. The ship's shielding stopped most of it, but most wasn't all. Cosmic rays slipped through in ways the designers hadn't fully modeled. Over 200 years, the cumulative dose added up. Cancer rates crept upward, 8% higher than projections. Autoimmune disorders appeared in families with no prior history. Then there were the changes no one could quite measure. The 3rd generation was taller, thinner, their cardiovascular systems subtly recalibrated for lower gravity. Blood pressure ran lower. Muscle fiber composition shifted. A doctor reviewing the data in year 238 wrote in her notes, "We are no longer genetically identical to the population that launched." She didn't mean mutation, she meant selection. The ship was choosing who thrived. Then the one system they couldn't live without began to fail. In year 251, the algae tanks in agricultural section C started dying. Not all at once. The biomass readings dropped 6% in a month, then 14% the next. The technicians couldn't find contamination, couldn't identify a pathogen. The water chemistry looked normal. The lights were running on schedule, but the algae kept thinning, and algae was the bottom of the food chain. Section C supplied 18% of the ship's oxygen and 22% of its protein feedstock. When the collapse spread to sections D and F, the crew had 11 weeks of reserves. Engineers tried adjusting nutrient flow, tweaking light spectra, reseeding from backup cultures. Nothing worked. By week 7, the atmospheric CO2 concentration had risen 340 parts per million. They never published the formal cause. The leading theory was genetic drift in the algae itself. 250 years of cloning from clones, microscopic errors compounding until the population lost some critical resilience. Another theory blamed trace metal depletion in the growth medium, something the recycling system should have replenished but didn't. A third pointed to voltage irregularities in the UV lamps, too small to detect, but large enough to stress the cultures over decades. The crew patched it. They always did. They cannibalized backup systems, stretched the remaining tanks, cut food production by 30% until new cultures stabilized. It took 9 months. So rationing returned, and with it, a fear that gnawed at everyone. The rations dropped to 1,400 calories per adult. Children got priority, which meant the working crew ran maintenance shifts on empty stomachs. Mistakes crept in. A coolant line ruptured because a tech missed a pressure reading after 14 hours without food. Families hoarded. Storage lockers were searched, and 3 people were confined for stashing nutrient paste. Trust fractured along deck lines. Upper sections accused lower of stealing water allocations. Council meetings turned into shouting matches that security had to break up. The ship felt smaller. Corridors that once hummed with conversation went quiet. People moved fast, eyes down, guarding what little they had. 2 years in, the population dropped by 11% as malnutrition took the elderly and the sick. Out of that desperation stepped a leader who promised a way through. Her name was Kale Vistron, and she'd spent 8 years running hydroponics on Deck 5. She knew every growth cycle, every backup protocol. At a packed assembly, she laid out a 3-year recovery plan with hard numbers, crop rotations, and a rotating labor schedule that spread the load. But she didn't stop at logistics. She talked about the voyage itself, the reason 20 generations had endured. She quoted the Founder's Accord, reminded people of the world waiting 680 years ahead. Her speeches were short, direct, and they packed the rec halls. Within 6 months, the rations stabilized at 1,650 calories. Volunteer shifts doubled. She reinstated Founders' Day ceremonies that hadn't been held in 40 years, reading mission logs aloud, showing images of Earth that most had only seen once or twice. The ship felt like it had a spine again, but the faith they revived was already curdling into something stranger. The ceremonies grew. What started as a reading of mission parameters turned into full ritual. People began referring to the original crew as the first shepherds. Their portraits, once filed in the archive, were printed and mounted in common areas. Children learned their names before they learned basic physics. The destination itself started to blur. Proxima Centauri b became the promised shore, then just the shore. Technical briefings about atmospheric composition were replaced with speeches about worthiness, sacrifice, endurance. When someone asked what the planet actually looked like, the answer was often poetic rather than precise. A new role emerged, the keeper of intent, someone who interpreted the Founder's vision and guided council votes. It wasn't elected. Kale took it, then named her successor before she died. The mission documents were still read, but now they were treated like scripture, verses cherry-picked to justify policy rather than inform it. Soon, almost no one believed the map they were still following. The destination coordinates still lived in the navigation system. 3 astrogators checked them every shift, adjusting course burns by fractions of a degree. But when children asked what they were flying toward, adults spoke in metaphors. Proxima b became the promised deck, a place of endless gardens and open sky. Some called it the Founder's Dream. Teachers stopped showing images of the planet's surface because the kids didn't understand what ground meant, what weather was, why water would pool instead of floating. By year 810, the annual arrival day ceremony had morphed into something else entirely. People still gathered, still recited the old words about landfall and settlement. But surveys showed 68% of residents under 30 believed it was allegory, a story about spiritual transformation rather than physical travel. The ship's trajectory hadn't changed. The fusion engines still burned on schedule, still pushed them toward a star 4.24 light-years from Earth. A generation was growing up certain the ship was the only world there ever was. In year 823, a 19-year-old named Mira made history as the first recorded human to openly state that Earth was a myth. She wasn't being provocative. She'd done the math, traced her family tree back 29 generations, found no living memory of anything beyond the hull. Her argument spread fast. How could 9,200 people have fit in these same corridors? Why would anyone choose to leave paradise for a metal tube? The old videos of Earth looked fake to her. Gravity too strange, horizons too far, that blue sky clearly an error in rendering. Within 5 years, a third of the population identified as shipborne purists, people who rejected the origin story entirely. They still followed the mission rules, still maintained the systems, but reinterpreted everything. The destination wasn't a planet. It was transcendence, a metaphor, the moment when the journey itself would be understood as sacred. The astrogators kept their heads down and said nothing about the transmissions they still monitored, the ones arriving every 4.7 years from a transmitter 800 light-years behind them. And then, from the direction of home, the signals stopped completely. The last transmission from Earth arrived in year 831. It was routine, a data packet with news updates, genetic research, refined trajectory corrections. The next one was due in 2836. It never came. At first, the communications team assumed a technical fault. They recalibrated the dish, boosted receiver sensitivity, waited. By 2841, 3 missed transmissions, they started considering alternatives. Solar interference, political collapse, a choice to stop broadcasting. The shipborne purists saw it as proof there was no Earth to transmit from, there never had been. The signals were automated, part of the simulation, and now the test was over. Traditional believers countered that something terrible had happened, that Earth needed help, that they had a duty to complete the mission and send word back. But parsecs are patient. Light takes 800 years to cross the distance they'd traveled. If Earth had died the day after launch, the ship wouldn't know for another 200 years. The silence proved nothing and everything. In that void, people began worshipping what they could no longer explain. Prayers began at the air recyclers. Offerings of welded metal appeared beside the water pumps. The reactor core became a shrine, its warning lights mistaken for divine favor. The founders' names turned into saints, their launch day speeches recited like scripture. Earth itself became heaven, a perfect world lost to sin or accident, depending on which deck you asked. No one remembered the planet's droughts or wars, only that it had been green and whole. Children learned to bow toward the bow, where the bridge sat locked and silent. The old mission directives, printed on fading plastic, were carried in processions no one could read anymore. Rituals replaced manuals. Belief filled the gaps that training had left behind. And a new priesthood rose to guard the controls no one else understood. They called themselves the Keepers, 12 families descended from the original engineering crew who passed technical knowledge from parent to child in closed ceremonies. They wore gray jumpsuits like vestments and spoke in acronyms the rest of the ship treated as holy language. Only Keepers entered the reactor chamber. Only Keepers touched the navigation systems, the life support cores, the seed vault locks. They claimed the ship's systems were too sacred, too fragile for untrained hands. In truth, the knowledge was too valuable to share. They held power not through weapons, but through dependency. A broken water filter, a failing oxygen scrubber, a cooling loop running hot, all required a keeper's blessing to repair. Their monopoly was absolute. It was also becoming a problem. When knowledge becomes holy, it also becomes dangerously scarce. By generation 34, only 9 people aboard could read the original technical documentation. By generation 38, that number dropped to 4. The keepers taught their children to perform procedures by rote, ritual sequences of button presses and valve turns, but rarely explained why. Understanding was replaced by tradition. A keeper might know to vent cooling system 3 every 72 hours without knowing what cooling system 3 actually cooled. They repeated their ancestors' instructions with religious precision, but the underlying engineering dissolved into myth. The technical library sat locked in the keeper's vault, accessed only during initiation rites. Manuals gathered dust. Diagnostic logs went unread. The archive contained 840 years of sensor data, maintenance records, and critical system warnings that no living keeper had checked in 6 generations. Their sacred manuals held warnings no one was permitted to read. The keepers didn't read the archive, they recited from it. Every morning they stood before the terminals and chanted passages from the diagnostic protocols, words they'd memorized phonetically, without understanding what CPU load or thermal differential meant. The manuals were holy objects, too sacred to actually open. When an apprentice once tried to decode a warning about reactor coolant flow, the elder keepers stopped him. The texts were revelation, not instruction. To interpret them was to corrupt them. In Section 7 of the Propulsion Archive, a cascading alert had been logging for 90 years. Plasma injector number 4 was failing. The magnetic containment field was degrading at 0.3% per year. At current rates, containment would drop below critical threshold in 18 months. The alert flashed in red text on a screen no one looked at, nested in a directory no one opened. The system screamed in a language the keepers had chosen to forget. So when the machine that kept them alive cried out, no one could understand it. The vibration started in Deck 11, a low hum that made tools rattle on metal shelves. Engineers from the lower decks recognized it immediately. Something in the propulsion core was wrong. They brought their concerns to the keepers, who consulted the rituals and declared the ship was singing its hymn of health. 3 weeks later, the hum became a grinding. Lights flickered in the aft sections. The magnetic bottle around the fusion plasma was losing coherence. If it failed completely, the reactor would shut down to prevent a breach. Without thrust, the ship would coast. Without power, life support would drain the batteries in 6 days. A lower deck engineer named Voss broke into the archive room. She pulled up the diagnostics, saw the 90 years of warnings, and understood exactly what was failing and why. She brought printouts to the council. They declared her a heretic for defiling scripture and locked her in the brig. The grinding got louder. Deck 12 lost power for 40 minutes. In the dark, someone finally listened. They pulled Voss from her cell, gathered every engineer who could read a schematic, and gave them 72 hours. It took a catastrophe to force them to work together, if only for a moment. They had no replacement parts. Injector number 4 was manufactured 830 years ago in a German orbital facility that no longer existed. So they built one. Machinists stripped metal from decommissioned HAB modules. Chemists synthesized ceramic insulators from recycled hull plating. 90 people worked in 8-hour shifts for 11 days straight. The installation required a reactor shutdown. They had one chance. If the magnetic bottle didn't re-engage, the plasma would dissipate and they'd need 6 months to reignite it. The batteries would be dead in a week. Voss and a crew of 12 entered the reactor space in radiation suits, replaced the injector, and recalibrated the containment field by hand. When they brought the reactor back online, the hum was gone. Thrust stabilized at 0.3 grams. The lights stopped flickering. For 6 days, the upper and lower decks celebrated together. Engineers were hailed as heroes. The keepers opened the archives to anyone who wanted to learn. Then the council received the resource audit. The repair had consumed 40% of their remaining structural alloy and 8 months of chemical feedstock. The hydroponic expansion they'd planned for the next decade was now impossible. They survived, but the price would tear their society in two. 3 engineers died in the collapse before the bulkhead sealed. Section 7C, 11,200 cubic meters of living space, was vented and locked behind emergency doors that were never designed to stay closed. 47 families lost their quarters in under 90 seconds. The survivors were redistributed across the ship, cramming 6 people into compartments rated for 4. Privacy vanished. The waiting list for private quarters, once 18 months, stretched to 9 years. Resentment built along a simple fault line. The families who'd lost everything blamed the council for delaying maintenance. The council blamed the engineers who'd pushed the old systems too hard. Both blamed the other decks for not sacrificing enough during the crisis. Meals in the common halls grew silent. People sat with their own. The memorial service for the dead split into 2 ceremonies, held 4 hours apart, attended by groups that wouldn't share the same room. In the aftermath, the ship split into 2 peoples who barely spoke. The upper decks, closer to the command modules and the observation ring, housed the families of engineers, navigators, and council members. They kept the mission logs, maintained the star charts, and controlled access to the ship's central systems. The lower decks ran the farms, the water recyclers, the protein vats. They worked 10-hour shifts in 30 degrees Celsius heat and 85% humidity, then returned to quarters where the air scrubbers rattled and the lights flickered. They hadn't seen the observation ring in 3 generations. Slang diverged first. The uppers called the agricultural sections the green, a term of respect from the mission's early years. The lowers started using topside as an insult, shorthand for people who didn't get their hands dirty. Within 50 years, children from each group spoke with different rhythms, different idioms. Marriages between decks dropped from 34% to 11% over 2 generations. When they did happen, one partner usually moved permanently, severing ties with their deck of origin. Family names became geographic markers. You could hear where someone was from in the first sentence they spoke. A line was drawn through the ship that no one was allowed to cross. Deck 4 sealed its main corridor at both ends, installing manual pressure doors that required a 6-digit code. Decks 8 through 11 followed 3 months later. Movement between sections required authorization from a deck supervisor, submitted 24 hours in advance. The uppers controlled the machine shops, the 3D printers, the chemical synthesis labs. They manufactured tools, spare parts, medical supplies. The lowers controlled the farms and the protein vats, producing 100% of the ship's calories. Trade happened at neutral airlocks. Goods passed through without conversation. Each side believed the other was hoarding resources. Deck 6 accused Deck 10 of diverting nitrogen fertilizer to build up reserves. Deck 10 claimed Deck 6 was printing luxury items while the agricultural sections went without repair kits. Inspections were refused. Audits were ignored. For 80 years, the segregation held. It was cold, inefficient, and costly, but it was stable. Children grew up never meeting anyone from the other decks. The ship's population of 4,200 lived as if they were on 2 separate vessels, drifting silently through the same dark. But air and water don't respect any border people draw. Year 847. The atmospheric processes on Deck 3 started pulling 18% more power than normal. Engineers on the upper levels noticed their water ration tanks draining faster, refilled from reserves they thought were shared equally. Someone had reprogrammed the distribution algorithms. Within 6 weeks, accusations flew across the divide. The lower decks claimed the upper families were hoarding oxygen scrubber capacity. The upper decks found their hydrogen reclamation units locked out by access codes they'd never seen. Both sides controlled parts of the same closed-loop system. Neither could survive if the other shut them out completely. A maintenance crew from Deck 7 tried to manually override a pressure valve on Deck 2. Security stopped them at the bulkhead. There was a scuffle. One engineer was shoved into a stairwell and broke her arm. By the next shift rotation, 130 people had armed themselves with pipe wrenches, arc welders, anything heavy enough to matter. The ship's AI logged 14 breaches of critical infrastructure zones in 9 days. Cooling lines were sabotaged. Backup oxygen tanks were sealed behind welded hatches. It escalated into a mutiny that nearly ended the voyage for good. The captain at the time, Maya Okonkwo, was 71 and had held the role for 22 years. She ordered a lockdown of all interdeck transit. It failed. Crew members with old override codes, passed down from the original engineers, opened the sealed doors within hours. Fighting concentrated around the central life support hub on Deck 5, a 40-meter diameter cylinder where water, air, and waste all recycled through the same core systems. If that hub went down, everyone had maybe 11 days of reserve air. A fire started in the electrical substation during a confrontation between two rival groups. Smoke filled 3 decks before they could vent it. The ship's hospital recorded 89 serious injuries over 16 days. 4 people died, 2 from smoke inhalation, 2 from blunt trauma during corridor fights. Okonkwo broadcast on every screen and speaker, threatening to vent entire sections to vacuum if the violence continued. It's unclear if she meant it. It's unclear if she even could have, with so many systems under contested control. What finally stopped it wasn't authority, it was exhaustion and the smell of burning insulation that wouldn't clear from the air processes. Both sides realized they were dismantling the only thing keeping them alive. The fragile peace they finally reached was built on a dangerous foundation: forgetting. The agreement was handwritten on paper torn from someone's ration logbook, signed by 11 people representing both factions. No trials for anyone involved, no record of who started it or why, no punishment, no blame. In exchange, everyone would delete the security footage, the injury reports, the accusations filed in the ship's legal database. They called it the Compact of Continuation. Within a month, over 2,400 files were erased from the central archives. Surveillance logs from 9 months before the fighting even started, gone. Engineering reports that detailed the original infrastructure disputes, wiped. Personal testimony, recorded by the AI mediator system, purged by vote of the council. Some families refused. They kept private records, journals hidden in storage lockers, memory chips sewn into clothing. But the official history, the version taught to children born afterward, said only that there had been a time of trouble, now resolved. By year 870, most teenagers had never heard the details. By year 895, even the adults who'd lived through it stopped talking. They rebuilt the trust by agreeing that the past didn't matter. Only the mission mattered, only survival. But among the files they deleted were maintenance logs, structural damage assessments, and the captain's original launch briefing that explained how the ship's systems were supposed to work. To bury the war, they deliberately destroyed the ship's own memory. The purge lasted 3 days. Engineering teams wiped navigation databases, erased personnel records dating back 800 years, and reformatted entire server banks to make sure nothing could be recovered. They kept only what they needed to keep the lights on and the air recyclers running. The ship's history, its origin, the names of the planets it had left behind, all of it went into the void. What remained was a generation that knew the ship was their world, but couldn't say why it existed or where it was going. The elders taught the children to trust the keepers, obey the schedules, and never ask about before. Most accepted it. They had food, they had routines, they had each other. But one child kept staring at the stars and asking what they really were. Her name was Mira, and she found the observation deck by accident while chasing a maintenance drone through a sealed corridor on Deck 9. The hatch was unlocked, the room beyond it dark except for a single porthole the size of her hand. She pressed her face to the glass. Outside, the black wasn't empty. Thousands of points of light scattered across the view, some white, some amber, some so faint they vanished if she looked directly at them. The keepers had told her the stars were glowing panels on the hull, painted there by the first generation to comfort the children. But these moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they drifted past the window as the ship rotated. She came back every night for a week, mapping their positions on stolen paper. The pattern shifted, but one light in the lower left corner grew steadily brighter. What she saw out there didn't match a single thing she'd been told. The bright star wasn't a star anymore. After 30 nights of observation, Mira could see it had structure, a disk of light with a pale center that didn't twinkle like the others. It sat almost directly ahead, growing week by week. She asked a keeper what it was. He told her to stop looking out the window. That curiosity about the hull markings led to obsession, and obsession led to instability. When she asked again, he reassigned her to the water farms and banned her from Deck 9. So she went lower. The ship had 14 decks, but the old technical libraries had been on Deck 2, near the original command center that no one had entered in 200 years. The access corridor was listed as structurally unsound, but the door opened when she tried it. Inside, she found cabinets full of printed manuals, star charts with coordinate grids, and a dust-covered binder labeled Mission Overview, Tau Ceti System. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but they were readable, so she started digging for a history her people had tried to bury. The binder gave her pieces. Launch date 2187. Crew manifest 12,000 souls. Target Tau Ceti E 11.9 light-years. She cross-referenced it with oral histories the elders told during festivals, stories about the Great Departure and the founders who walked with engines. Most of the ship's original database had degraded decades ago. What survived lived in isolated memory cores scattered across maintenance hubs. She spent weeks hunting them down, copying fragments onto salvaged drives. One file showed the planned trajectory. Another held crew rotation schedules for the first 200 years. A third contained a single corrupted video, a woman in a blue jumpsuit explaining deceleration protocols, her voice cutting in and out. The keepers had never mentioned any of this. They taught that the journey was eternal, that arrival was a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment, not a coordinate in space. She kept digging. Her search led her to a door the keepers had sealed generations ago. The lock was mechanical, not electronic. Someone had welded a steel plate over the keypad, then painted it to match the corridor wall. She used a plasma cutter from the repair shop, working in 20-minute intervals so the noise wouldn't carry. It took her 3 nights. The room beyond was small, maybe 4 meters across. Dust hung in the air like fog. Along one wall sat a control console she recognized from the training video, its screen dark but intact. The other wall held filing cabinets, their drawers labeled by year, 2187 to 2310. She pulled the drawer marked 3180 to 3190. Inside were handwritten logs, maintenance reports, and a laminated card with access codes. One report, dated 3184, mentioned a council vote to restrict navigation data to priesthood only. Another, from 3187, described the ceiling of this room. She powered the console. It booted. A navigation display flickered to life, showing their position, their velocity, and a countdown timer she didn't understand at first. Then she did. Inside was a figure that froze her cold, exactly how close they now were. The timer read 41 years, 7 months, 18 days. Not centuries, not some distant myth her grandchildren might witness. She would be 63 when the ship reached Tau Ceti's gravity well. Her younger brother would be 59. The children born last year would be in their prime. She pulled up the mission timeline from the original files. Deceleration was supposed to begin 50 years out, a decades-long burn to slow the ship from 12% light speed. They'd already missed the window by 8 years. Starting late meant a harder burn, more stress on the engines, higher risk. The console showed fuel reserves at 68%, enough if they started soon. The fusion reactors were functional. The nav system still had the target locked. On paper, it was all there. She scrolled through the procedure files, pages of technical instructions for initiating the deceleration sequence, aligning the ship, firing the primary engines in controlled intervals. Every manual assumed the reader had gone through years of training. They referenced subsystems she'd never heard of, acronyms with no legend, safeguards that required knowledge no one aboard still possessed. But there was a catch. No one alive knew how to actually land. The ship's main archive held 47 terabytes of Earth data, but the descent protocols were scattered across 9 separate directories, each locked behind permissions that required roles that didn't exist anymore. She found a checklist for atmospheric entry that called for a flight dynamics officer, a thermal protection specialist, and something called a planetfall coordinator. There were 1,200 people on the ship. None of them had those titles. Worse, the keepers had rewritten parts of the manual themselves over the centuries. Where the original text said, "Initiate deceleration burn at 0.3 light-years from target," someone had added a margin note, "The stars are not for landing, they are for worship." The technical specifications were still there, but they'd been buried under 18 generations of commentary that treated arrival as metaphor, not engineering. She could decode the procedure, maybe even train a crew if she had 5 years. But the ship's nav system showed 11 months to the star, and when she tried to share what she'd found, people looked at her like she was describing a dream. The faithful had been taught that the destination was symbolic, a test of devotion, not a place you could actually reach. So she had to convince a people who believed the outside world was a lie. She started in the lower decks where people still fixed things instead of praying over them. She showed them the deceleration timeline, the fuel calculations, the fact that the ship's trajectory would carry them straight past the star if they did nothing. 34 engineers signed on in the first week. They began running simulations, testing whether the old thruster systems could even fire after 900 years of neglect. But convincing the rest meant dismantling a worldview. The faithful believed the voyage was eternal by design, that the ship itself was sacred, that talk of arrival was a test of faith to see who would abandon the journey. She had to prove the original mission was real, that their ancestors had intended to stop, that the star ahead wasn't a religious symbol but a navigation marker. She pulled up the oldest logs, the ones written before the myths took hold, and projected them in the central hall. 400 people came. Half walked out. The converts grew slowly. A teacher who'd always questioned the scriptures, a family who'd lost someone to the water wars and wanted to believe there was a reason for it all, a maintenance worker who'd seen the fuel reserves and knew they were finite. By month 7, she had maybe 600 people who accepted that landing was possible. But the ship held 1,200, and the other half answered to a council that had ruled for 200 years by keeping everyone focused inward. The keepers who ruled the ship had everything to lose from the truth. The council called her in on day 219. They didn't arrest her, but they made it clear her arrival propaganda was destabilizing the social order. People were questioning the liturgies, refusing to attend the old ceremonies, asking why they should follow rules designed for an eternal journey if the journey was about to end. The head keeper, a man whose family had held power for 6 generations, told her the ship had survived this long because people accepted their place. If she kept pushing, he said, she'd see how quickly 1,200 people could turn into chaos. She asked what would happen when the star filled the viewports and they had no plan. He said the star was a metaphor. She pulled up the nav display and showed him the deceleration window. 81 days left before they'd need to fire the engines or overshoot entirely. He said the engineers would handle it when the time came. She told him the engineers were on her side and that they'd already found that 14 of the 20 primary thrusters were frozen solid. He stopped answering her questions. The council met in private for 3 days. Rumors spread that they'd vote to shut down her access to the archive, maybe even lock her in the lower decks where the dissenters used to go. She'd prepared for that. She'd copied the landing protocols to 40 separate terminals and taught 12 people how to execute them. If the keepers wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to suppress half the ship. But they didn't get the chance to choose. Then the ship made the decision for them. The shudder ran through the hull at 0317 ship time. Not violent, constant. A low hum that climbed into the bones of everyone aboard, awake or sleeping. The main drives had fired for the first time in 947 years. Deceleration burn, 0.3 grams, scheduled to continue for 86 days. Gravity shifted. Objects that had hung in place for generations began to drift toward the aft bulkheads. The ship was slowing, and for the first time in living memory, there was a direction you could point to and call forward. Cameras on the bow began streaming data to navigation. The archive keepers tried to lock the feeds, but 12,000 people had already linked in. As they turned to face their destination, lights appeared where there should have been none. Spectrometry confirmed it within the hour. Narrowband emissions at 450,000, 520, and 610 nanometers, the wavelengths of artificial illumination. Not starlight, not atmospheric scatter, cities. The target world had been surveyed 1,031 years ago by probe. Oxygen atmosphere, liquid water, no industrial signatures. The colonization committee had chosen it for exactly that reason, empty. Now the night side showed a web of light across 4 continents. Population estimates ranged from 40 million to 600 million, depending on assumptions about grid density and power generation. Someone had settled the planet while they were in transit. Radio telescopes picked up microwave leakage, almost certainly communications traffic. The Engineering Council ran the intercept through linguistic analysis. No match to Earth languages in the database. No match to anything. Suddenly the question wasn't whether they could land, it was who was already down there. The first theory was overtake. Faster ships launched after them, maybe 200 or 400 years later, using fusion or antimatter drives the original mission never had. It happened in the simulations. You leave at 12% light speed, someone leaves at 40%, you arrive to a functioning colony that forgot you were coming. But the power signatures were wrong. Energy output looked consistent with late industrial or early fusion economies, not the kind of infrastructure a mature interstellar civilization would deploy. If Earth had sent a second wave, they'd have better tech than this. The second theory was darker. Independent genesis, parallel evolution, a separate lineage that happened to build cities at the same time humans were crossing the void to meet them. The odds were obscene, but the lights didn't care about odds. Crowds gathered in the observation galleries, staring at the feed. Some wanted to abort, burn lateral, and find another world. Others argued they had no fuel for a new search. The vote was 3 days away when the directional array locked onto a signal. Amplitude modulation, 407 megahertz, repeating every 19 seconds. And then a transmission arrived, in a language almost like their own. The syntax was wrong in places. Pronouns had shifted. Whole verb tenses they'd stopped using 600 years ago appeared in every third line, but it was unmistakably human. The message contained coordinates, a greeting protocol, and a 90-second audio file compressed in a format their system couldn't decode. The linguistics AI had been offline for 340 years to save power. Council argued for 11 hours. Some wanted to respond immediately. Others pointed out they had no idea what they'd be saying, or to whom. The audio file might contain instructions, warnings, or proof this was a trap. The only system that could pass the compression, translate the drifted language, and verify the signal's origin was the ship's central archive, sealed since year 287. To answer it, they had to wake the one mind that remembered everything. The core occupied 14 server racks in a chamber 3 decks below the main habitat ring. Cooling had been cut in year 287, when the Council decided the crew no longer needed access to Earth's databases, mission logs, or the founder generation's personal records. It took 4 days to bring the thermal management back online and another 16 hours for the system to complete its integrity checks. When the interface finally responded, The first thing it did was query the ship's clock, compare it to its own internal log, and display a single line: 739 years, 4 months, 11 days since last access. They fed it the transmission. The core processed it in 90 seconds, then requested authentication from 3 crew members who'd been dead for 500 years. The override took another 6 hours. When it finally granted access, the system opened 11 restricted directories, 4,000 hours of video records, and the original mission parameters filed under encryption the crew had long forgotten existed. The machine knew things about their own history no living person did. The core began with the basics. Departure, April 14, 2357. Origin, Earth, Sol System. Destination, Proxima Centauri b, 4.24 light-years. Planned transit time, 850 years at 0.05 c. Crew manifest, 1,847 founding members. Mission objective, establish the first interstellar human colony. Then it showed them what they'd lost. The databanks held 6 petabytes of Earth history, art, literature, and science. Navigation records with star charts accurate to within 0.3 arcseconds. Genetic diversity protocols designed to sustain 50 generations. Atmospheric composition logs from Earth's final decade before the fleet launched. It catalogued the drift. In year 104, power rationing cut access to the historical archives. Year 287, the Council voted to disable the core entirely after a faction tried to use old records to challenge the leadership. By year 412, fewer than 30 people alive had ever seen Earth's coastline, even in a recording. The machine played the decoded audio file without comment, 90 seconds of a woman's voice, speaking in the old syntax, explaining how her ship had left Earth 150 years after theirs, travelled twice as fast, and arrived at Proxima 81 years ago. And finally, the buried message from centuries ago made terrible sense. The transmission from Earth had been vague on purpose. It mentioned breakthrough fusion architectures, plasma confinement ratios improved by factors of 40, theoretical cruise velocities approaching 0.18 c. Numbers that would have cut their journey time in half. But the real warning was buried in the timestamp metadata. The message had been sent 87 years after their launch, when Earth's industrial capacity had finally caught up to the designs their own ship had carried as blueprints. Which meant any vessel built with that tech would depart nearly a century behind them, but arrive decades ahead. The Engineering Council ran the projections 3 times. A ship leaving Earth in year 112, traveling at 0.17 c instead of their 0.09 c, would reach Proxima in 280 years total. Their own ship, already 950 years into a 1,040-year voyage, was still 90 years out. That old message pointed to an arithmetic none of them wanted to face. The math was brutal in its simplicity. Every decade Earth delayed launch, they could boost cruise speed by another 0.01 c and still arrive earlier. A ship leaving in year 200 at 0.22 c would beat them by 170 years. One leaving in year 300 at 0.28 c would beat them by 310 years. The woman's voice on the recording had confirmed the worst case. Her vessel, the UNSS Meridian, had launched in year 167 with a helium-3 catalyzed fusion drive and a cruise speed of 0.19 c. Total travel time, 246 years. Arrival at Proxima, year 413. Which meant when the original generation ship finally reached orbit in year 1057, the Meridian colonists would have been on the surface for 644 years. Not a rival mission, not a competing claim, an established civilization with 20 generations of local history. But being overtaken turned out to be the smaller of 2 horrors. The Meridian's message had been recorded 81 years ago, in year 494. The population then was already 940,000, spread across 11 sealed habitat domes on Proxima b. They'd mentioned orbital infrastructure, atmospheric processors running at 34% efficiency, and a third-generation fusion grid producing 1.8 terawatts. But the telescopes now showed light signatures far beyond what a 494-era colony could produce. The spectrographic scans picked up industrial emissions consistent with populations in the tens of millions. Thermal blooms suggesting cities, not domes. Orbital traffic patterns with dozens of distinct drive plumes, not the 4 shuttles the Meridian had reported. The updated math was sickening. If Earth had kept launching ships every 50 years with incrementally better engines, each new wave would have arrived progressively earlier, layering on top of the last. The 4th wave might have landed in year 520, the 7th in year 680. By year 1057, Proxima b could host a population of 80 million with 6 centuries of uninterrupted development, which meant their entire 1,000-year voyage might have been for nothing. For 3 generations they'd maintained the gardens, rationed water to 1.2 liters per day, buried children who didn't survive the crossing. Every meal eaten was a meal their ancestors didn't. Every birth was planned around carrying capacity limits that kept families to 1.7 children on average. And now a civilization that never left home had beaten them there by 6 centuries. The Ark's entire social contract, the thing that kept 14,000 people cooperating in 9 cubic kilometers for 40 generations, had been built on one promise: that their children's children's children would inherit a world. But Proxima b already had 80 million inheritors who didn't spend a millennium in a can. The archive logs showed 47 attempted mutinies over the centuries, each crushed because the mission was sacred. Now the mission itself was in question. Some argued they should refuse contact entirely, burn their remaining fuel, and limp to another star. Others wanted to descend and claim what they'd bled for. It came down to a single vote that would decide all their fates. The Council opened the vote to the entire ship for the first time in 290 years. Every citizen over 16 got a voice. Proceed to contact and orbital insertion, or execute a gravity assist and continue outward with 18% fuel reserves. The debates ran for 11 days across every HAB section. Faction leaders pointed out that outward meant 1,400 more years to Tau Ceti, with no guarantee the same thing wouldn't happen again. The opposition countered that arriving as beggars to a world they no longer had claim to was worse than dying free. Medical ran projections. At current consumption rates, the ship had 90 years of biological viability left before inbreeding coefficients and accumulated genetic load made the population non-viable. Tau Ceti would require at least 6 more generations. The math was unforgiving. The vote came back 58% in favor of contact, a slim margin that left 5,880 people opposed to what came next. But orbital mechanics don't wait for a vote. The deceleration burn had already been committed. At 0.12 C, reversing course required more delta V than they possessed. The ship was falling into Proxima's gravity well, whether they liked it or not, and the transfer window to achieve stable orbit closed in 73 hours. Engineering fired the insertion burn at 0422 ship time. The maneuver took 9 hours and consumed the last of their deuterium reserves, dropping them into a 12,000 kilometers elliptical orbit. Retrograde because they'd been decelerating. Unstable because they had no fuel left to correct it. They had 90 days before orbital decay pulled them down. No way to climb back out, no way to escape. The ship had become a temporary moon with 14,000 people aboard, and one option left. Proxima b filled the forward viewports now, 4.2 times Earth's radius, cloud patterns clearly visible across the daylight terminator, and across the night side, a constellation of lights that could only be cities. So they braced to meet whatever, or whoever, waited below. The ship's command council convened in silence. 1,127 people remained alive aboard Odyssey, the last descendants of 3,000 who'd launched from Earth. None of them had ever imagined this. They'd trained for first contact with indigenous life, for sterile worlds, for atmospheric toxins, not for lights in geometric grids, not for radio transmissions in a language that sounded almost human. The linguists worked in 18-hour shifts, feeding samples into the translation algorithms. The syntax matched old Earth languages, drifted just enough to be alien. Captain Okafor ordered a comms blackout, no transmission until they understood what they were hearing. Every surviving family gathered in the observation decks, 47 generations compressed into 3. The children pressed against the viewports, asking questions no elder could answer. Then the clouds parted, and they saw the world for the first time. Proxima b turned below them, 1.3 times Earth's diameter, wrapped in nitrogen and oxygen at ratios their instruments recognized immediately. The southern hemisphere wore green across its landmasses, not the rust red of lifeless iron, but the unmistakable signature of chlorophyll. Oceans covered 61% of the surface, cobalt blue under the red dwarf's light. Weather systems spiraled across the tropics. The spectroscopy team confirmed water vapor, carbon dioxide at 420 parts per million, methane traces consistent with active biology. It was everything they'd hoped for, a living world, stable, thriving, capable of sustaining human life without centuries of terraforming. The crops could grow there, the children could breathe there. They could finally stop living inside machines. But the night side told a different story. Clusters of light followed river valleys and coastlines, too bright to be bioluminescence, too regular to be natural. The infrared scans showed heat signatures in rectangular patterns, roads cutting straight lines through forests, and spread across its continents were cities that should not have existed. The largest settlement sprawled across a coastal plain near the equator, 200 square kilometers of structures and transit lines. Smaller hubs dotted the temperate zones, maybe 40 or 50 urban centers visible from orbit. Population estimates ranged from 800,000 to 3 million, depending on density assumptions. The architecture read human, right angles, modular construction, solar arrays on every rooftop. One city had what looked like a stadium. Another showed a spaceport, inactive but intact, fusion torch scars still visible on the landing pads. Whoever lived down there had arrived with fusion drives, with fabrication tech, with the industrial base to bootstrap a civilization in under 200 years. The math was impossible. Odyssey had launched in 2147, the fastest ship humanity could build. Nothing could have beaten them here. But someone had. Captain Okafor opened a channel, no encryption, broadcast on every frequency their systems could generate. A response came back in 4.7 seconds, a woman's voice speaking clear, unaccented English, asking them to maintain orbit and prepare for docking. The moment 1,000 years had been building toward had finally come. The ship's cameras tracked the surface as they crossed into daylight. Below them stretched a sprawl of structures that dwarfed anything Earth had known when they left. Cities wrapped around coastlines and networked across plains with transit lines glowing faint in infrared. There were 3 orbital platforms in geosynchronous positions, each one larger than the generation ship itself, and hundreds of smaller satellites threading through the space between. Navigation beacons pulsed in rhythm, mapping safe corridors through a traffic system that had clearly been operating for decades. The planet wasn't waiting to be colonized. It had already been settled, built up, woven into a functioning system of transport and power and communication. Then a voice hailed them from the world below. The woman introduced herself as Administrator Chen, speaking for the Kepler Colonial Authority. She welcomed them by name, said they'd been tracking the ship's approach for 18 months, ever since it crossed into the system's heliopause and triggered the outer warning grid. She said the planet had been expecting them. Historical records preserved the original mission launch date, the passenger manifest, even the ship's intended trajectory and deceleration profile. They'd prepared housing, medical facilities, integration protocols for a population that had spent generations in transit. Captain Okafor asked the question everyone on the bridge already knew would fracture their understanding of everything. How long has your colony been here? Chen's answer came back without hesitation. 47 years since initial landing, 512 since the first survey satellites arrived in system. But what they said about when they arrived made no sense.
The generation ship left Earth in 2187. It had been traveling for 1,003 years, which meant they arrived in 3190. Chen's timeline put the first colonial infrastructure in orbit around Kepler 442b in the year 2678, more than 5 centuries earlier. Dr. Amal ran the numbers 4 times, checked the Earth Standard Calendar against their onboard clock, verified the timestamp on Chen's transmission. Every calculation returned the same impossible result. A colony that shouldn't exist for another 5-12 years had been waiting for them, tracking their slow approach across the dark.
There was no error in the math, no relativistic trick that could account for it. The generation ship had left first, maintained continuous thrust for 1,000 years, followed the most efficient, brachistochrone trajectory their propulsion systems allowed. The only explanation was a ship that left Earth after them and got there first. The timestamps in the archives made it clear. A second expedition had departed Earth 230 years after the generation ship, carrying a propulsion system the original voyagers couldn't have imagined. Fusion torches capable of sustaining 0.3 grams for decades, cutting transit time by 60%.
While the generation ship coasted through the silent middle centuries of its journey, that newer vessel burned past them at velocities their grandparents would have called impossible. It arrived 140 years before the generation ship entered orbit. The colonists had already been here for 5 generations.
The people on the generation ship had lived their entire lives in service of a mission that was outdated before their great-grandparents died. They'd rationed water, repaired failing systems, buried children in the recyclers, all while the real colony was already being built. Everything they had endured had been quietly outrun by time itself. The crew who'd maintained those ion engines for 40 generations had done it for nothing. The agronomists who'd optimized every gram of yield, the engineers who'd stretched failing components past their design life, the parents who'd raised children knowing they'd never see the destination, all of it rendered moot by a ship that didn't exist when they launched. Earth had continued advancing while they drifted through the void. Breakthroughs in particle physics, materials science, energy density, each one shaving years off the transit time, each one arriving too late to help the generation ship. By the time the voyagers passed the halfway mark, their vessel was already a relic. The colonists below had built cities, established governments, developed new industries from the planet's resources. They'd had 140 years to adapt to the gravity, to engineer crops for the local soil chemistry, to diverge from the mission parameters the generation ship still carried in its databases. And the descendants of that faster ship had grown into an entire world. The genetic markers confirmed it. Same human baseline, same Earth origin, launched from the same orbital facilities. The people below were cousins, not aliens. Children of the same homeworld, separated by a 230-year gap in departure dates and a century-long head start on adaptation. But the generation ship's inhabitants had spent 1,000 years in 0.4 gram spin gravity, breathing recycled air, eating vat-grown protein. Their bone density had dropped 18%. Their cardiovascular systems had adapted to lower pressures. Their circadian rhythms had drifted from the 24-hour cycle. The medical logs showed 47 genetic shifts that had become fixed in the population. The colonists had gone the other direction. Born under 1.1 G, lungs adapted to 23% oxygen, immune systems trained against local microbes. Their language had drifted. Their social structures had evolved under different constraints. Their collective memory reached back only to the landing. But 1,000 years apart had made them almost different species. The doctors ran comparative scans. Bone density varied by 18%. Cardiovascular efficiency showed a 22% divergence. The planet-born moved differently, their gait calibrated to 1.1 grams from birth, while the ship crew walked like they were always bracing for a fall. Language had fractured too. The ship still spoke standard English, preserved in educational cores and ceremonial readings. The colonists spoke what linguists would call a daughter language. 47% of its vocabulary shifted or invented, grammar streamlined under the pressure of a new world. Cultural drift cut deeper. The ship crew organized around maintenance guilds and resource rotation, every choice governed by scarcity. The planet-born had built towns with open streets, economies driven by agriculture and mining, social hierarchies the voyagers didn't recognize.
They could still communicate. They could still recognize each other as human. But the gap was wider than anyone had modeled. Now the arrival crew had to choose: descend into a world they didn't belong to, or drift forever.
The debate consumed 6 weeks. Stay aboard, and the ship could sustain maybe 200 more years before critical systems failed beyond repair. Fusion fuel remained, but spare parts for life support were cannibalizing themselves. The hull had microfractures in 11 sections. Descend, and they'd face 1.1 grams that would crush the elderly within months. The atmosphere carried microbes their immune systems had never seen. They'd need years of conditioning, phased gravity adaptation, inoculations against 30 identified pathogens. Some argued for a hybrid: land the able-bodied, keep a skeleton crew in orbit to maintain the ship as a station. Others wanted to push on, find a less developed world where they could be the first. But the fuel budget allowed 1 landing, maybe 2, and the nearest candidate system was 8.3 light-years away. In the end, 83% voted to land. They'd spent a millennium crossing the dark to reach this world. Turning back felt like erasing every generation that had kept the voyage alive. So they moved to open doors that had stayed shut for 1,000 years. The primary airlock had been welded closed 947 years earlier, when the last exterior maintenance crew came back inside. Engineers spent 4 days cutting through corrosion and redundant seals, each layer a relic of a different century's safety protocols. The outer hatch swung open at 14:22 ship time. Unfiltered light poured in, not the calculated spectrum of grow lamps but raw starlight mixed with the orange glow of a K-type sun. It hurt to look at. It was beautiful in a way no simulation had prepared them for. The landing craft had been built 600 years ago, maintained but never used, their heat shields tested only in virtual environments. 12 shuttles sat ready in the hangar, each one rated for 40 passengers and 2,000 kilograms of cargo. The first crew strapped in, their hands shaking against the unfamiliar restraints. Descent took 47 minutes. The hull heated to 1,400 degrees Celsius as they cut through atmosphere, friction doing what no shipborne human had felt in living memory. They touched down on a prepared pad 15 kilometers from the colonial capital, engines kicking up red dust, and for the first time in 40 generations, a human breathed unfiltered air. The hatch opened and light flooded in, unfiltered and raw. The first voyager stepped onto soil and looked up at a sky that had no ceiling, just blue, stretching into nothing. Wind moved across her skin, carrying smells she had no names for. Rain fell on the 3rd day. Water from clouds, not recyclers. It soaked through their clothes, and they stood there, 200 people watching weather happen. The sun rose without a warning chime, set without dimming protocols, and the temperature swung 18 degrees Celsius between noon and midnight. They walked further each day. The horizon kept retreating. At night, the stars didn't move in neat arcs behind reinforced glass. They just hung there, thousands more than the ship's portholes ever showed. One engineer lay on his back for 4 hours, watching satellites drift by, crying without sound. The colonists brought them fruit grown in real soil, under a real sun. It tasted different, sharper. The voyagers ate slowly, their guts unused to anything that hadn't been cultivated in hydroponic trays under 240 nanometer LEDs, but their bodies had never known real gravity or sunlight, and it showed. The first collapse came 11 days after landing. A woman in her 30s, bone density 64% of planetary baseline, femur snapped while climbing stairs. Then a boy, 19, retinas burned after 40 minutes in direct sun, the opsin proteins in his eyes coded for the ship's controlled spectrum. The medical data came in fast. Average Voyager height, 9 centimeters taller than colonists, spines elongated over centuries of 0.8 grams rotation gravity, cardiovascular systems strained under 1.0 grams, heart walls thinner, blood pressure spiking, immune responses misfired against planetary bacteria their ancestors hadn't seen in 40 generations. The colonial hospital filled, 67 Voyagers in critical care within 3 weeks. Genetic divergence had been predicted, but the models undershot reality. The ship's population had drifted, isolated, selecting for traits that helped you survive a closed loop, not an open world. They tried everything: calcium infusions, gene therapy, graduated exposure protocols. Some adapted, bones thickened, eyes adjusted, lungs learned to handle pollen and spores. Others didn't. 22 Voyagers died in the first 6 months, their systems too specialized, too far from the human baseline the planet demanded. For some, the world they'd traveled 1,000 years to reach was fatal. After the first year, 81 Voyagers made the choice. They boarded the shuttle, went back up, and didn't come down again. The ship still orbited, station-keeping thrusters firing on schedule, life support humming in the hab rings where 40 generations had lived and died. Some stayed because their bodies couldn't take it. Bones too fragile, hearts too weak, eyes too sensitive. Others stayed because they didn't want to. The planet felt wrong. Too big, too loud, too open. They'd been born in corridors 3 meters wide, rooms with walls you could touch. The sky had no edges, and it made them feel like they were falling. They kept the ship running, tended the gardens, maintained the reactor, walked the old routes their ancestors had walked. Messages went back and forth, surface to orbit. Some of the Voyagers below visited, came back up for a week, then went down again. Some never left. The colonial government offered support, supplies, medical staff, retrofit of the hab decks. The 81 declined most of it. They had what they needed. The ship wasn't a lifeboat anymore, wasn't transportation. It was where they belonged, the place their lineage had made, the vessel that had carried them here, even if here wasn't for them. For them, the ship became both a home and a monument at once. They preserved it, not just the hull, not just the engines, but the gardens, the observation decks, the corridors where 40 generations had learned to walk. The descendants who stayed aboard turned sections into archives, mapping every modification their ancestors had made, cataloging the tools that had kept them alive. It became a museum that still breathed recycled air, a monument you could live inside. Families visited from the surface, walked the halls their great-great-grandparents had known only as the entire universe. They stood in the centrifuge rings where children had run in circles for exercise, touched the porthole glass that had framed the same stars for a millennium. The ship held every adaptation, every compromise, every small victory over entropy. It was proof they'd survived, proof the journey had been real. But it also became a barrier, a physical reminder of how far the two groups had already drifted. Down on the surface, two branches of humanity finally had to face each other. The first meetings were careful, formal, dressed in translation algorithms even though both sides spoke recognizable English. Surface dwellers saw people whose bodies moved wrong in full gravity, whose eyes searched instinctively for walls and ceilings. Ship descendants saw strangers who'd never known rationing, never felt the hull shudder, never lived with the certainty that a single seal failure could kill everyone you loved. They traded stories like archaeologists comparing artifacts. The Voyagers described the crossing riots of year 487, when three rival factions fought over water reclamation policy. The settlers shared records of the founding winter, when their first harvest failed and 1,840 colonists died in 14 months. Both sides had war memorials, famine years, heroes who'd saved their people through impossible choices. But grief lived in the spaces between words. The voyagers mourned the earth their ancestors had described, the one that existed only in degraded video files and half-remembered songs. The settlers mourned the genetic diversity, the expertise, the cultural complexity that had been lost when only 50,000 colonists landed, while 2 million more drifted through the dark. The settled world had kept fragments of Earth the voyagers never knew survived. The colony had built museums from the first decade, deliberate acts of memory when survival still wasn't guaranteed. They'd brought seeds in cryo-storage, 47,000 species of plants the voyagers had reduced to 91 edible cultivars. They had whole libraries, literature and film and music the ship's databases had corrupted or deleted to save space. They'd preserved accents, regional recipes, the texture of cultures the voyagers had blended into a single hybrid identity. The settlers had carried a version of Earth forward, tried to rebuild it under an alien sun. They had forests, not gardens. They had weather, not climate control. Children grew up knowing rain, snow, wind, the weight of a sky that went up forever. They'd spent 8 centuries trying to make the planet feel like home, importing memory into every brick and field. But preservation has a cost. The settled world had optimized, specialized, planted roots. They'd made choices about what mattered, what could be saved, what had to be left behind in the rush to terraform and survive. They'd built a new Earth, but they'd built it from a snapshot, frozen at the moment of departure. But the voyagers held something the settlers had long since lost.
The voyagers carried 1,000 years of adaptation the settlers never had to face. Every generation aboard had learned to fix what broke, to stretch resources, to make choices when no resupply was coming. They'd developed rituals for grief in closed spaces, protocols for conflict when you couldn't walk away, medicines tailored to bodies that had never felt planetary gravity. The settlers had received Earth's knowledge as of 2157, a fixed archive, but the ship had continued to evolve it generation by generation, solving problems the original designers never imagined. They'd invented new mathematics for navigation around relativistic debris fields, new social structures for maintaining continuity across 40 generations, new ways to raise children who would never see the destination their great-grandparents had left for.
The settlers had built a civilization by unpacking what they'd brought. The voyagers had built one by becoming something new. They'd carried forward not just data, but lived experience, the compressed wisdom of a lineage that had survived the longest single journey in human history. In that difference lay the gift 1,000 years had quietly forged. The gift wasn't arriving first, it was arriving at all. The voyagers had become proof that humans could endure the unendurable, that a society could hold itself together across timescales no civilization on Earth had ever faced. They were walking evidence that continuity was possible, even when no single person lived to see both beginning and end. The settlers had colonized a planet. The voyagers had colonized time. They'd learned to think in generations, to value what would outlast them, to maintain systems their grandchildren's grandchildren would depend on. That capacity, that 1,000-year attention span, was what they brought to the new world. Not just hands for labor or minds for science, but a culture built around persistence. The voyage had made them different, yes, but it had made them capable of planning across centuries, of sacrificing for futures they'd never see, of holding together when every instinct said to fracture. The ship had been a crucible, and what emerged wasn't a relic. It was a people who knew, in their bones, how to survive anything. And with that, the question their ancestors had asked was finally answered. Why are we here? Not by accident, not as backup. The voyage had purpose because it created something that couldn't have existed otherwise. a lineage that had stared into the void for 40 generations and refused to blink, a culture forged in isolation that still chose connection, a people who had every reason to give up and didn't.
The answer wasn't written in the mission files from 2157. It was written in the children born in year 487 who learned to read by starlight, in the engineers of Generation 23 who rebuilt the water reclamation system with tools their ancestors never imagined. In the council of year 891 that voted to keep going when the ship could have drifted. Every choice, every life, every generation that said yes to the future.
They were here because the voyage had made them necessary. The settlers had speed, but the voyagers had depth. And now, standing on solid ground for the first time in 1,000 years, they understood what their ancestors couldn't have known when they closed the airlock and fired the engines. The journey hadn't delayed their arrival. It had prepared them for it. There was one thing left to do: send a word back toward Earth. The transmission went out at the speed of light, compressed and redundant, aimed at a star 1,000 years behind them. It wasn't a distress call. It was a report. We made it. We survived. We're home. The message carried biodiversity catalogs, cultural records, genetic profiles of the founder population. It included a timestamp marking the exact moment they opened the outer doors. It told Earth, or whoever might intercept it, that humanity had taken root in another system. No one alive would see the reply. The signal would crawl back across the void for centuries, arriving at a planet that had aged 2,000 years since launch. Whether cities still stood there, whether anyone remembered the ship's name, whether Earth itself had sent out others in the interim, none of that could be known. An answer would take centuries to arrive, if anyone was still there to send one. They walked out under a real sky for the first time in their lives. Gravity felt different, pulled by a planet instead of rotation. The air moved in ways no ventilation system could replicate, carrying scents the ship had never synthesized. Some knelt and touched soil. Others stood in silence, overwhelmed by horizons that didn't curve upward. Children born in the final decade ran ahead, their bodies adapting faster than their parents. The elderly, who'd spent 80 or 90 years inside steel, wept at clouds. This was the payoff, not just survival, but arrival. Not just endurance, but a future that stretched beyond bulkheads and shift schedules. A world where their children's children wouldn't memorize the maintenance manual, where forgetting the ship would be a gift, not a betrayal. So what does a 1,000-year voyage really tell us about ourselves? Generation ships sit at the intersection of two impulses, the drive to explore and the weight of consequence. They ask whether we'd sacrifice entire lifetimes, generations who never consented, for a destination they'd never see. Whether the journey itself could hold enough meaning to justify what it demands. We keep returning to them in fiction, in engineering studies, in late-night thought experiments, because they strip away escapism. There's no cryosleep handwave, no faster-than-light shortcut. Just people, time, and the question of what we owe to those who come after us. They force us to confront what civilization means when you can't leave, when your choices bind your descendants, when culture becomes survival infrastructure, when the only immortality available is the one you build into systems and stories and bloodlines. It comes down to a paradox that makes these ships so haunting to imagine. Here's the calculation that stops every generation ship proposal cold. Launch a ship at 0.1 C today, and it reaches Proxima Centauri in 43 years. But propulsion technology improves roughly 2% per year. Wait 50 years to launch, and your ship arrives 20 years earlier than the one you sent first. The math gets worse the farther you go. A 500-year voyage to a star 50 light-years out could be overtaken 6 times by ships launched decades apart, each generation of colonists arriving to find the descendants of people who left after them already building cities. You're not exploring, you're becoming archaeological evidence of an earlier attempt. Engineers call this the incessant obsolescence problem. Economists call it the weight calculation. Both names hide what it really asks. If later ships will always beat earlier ones, if the first crew will always lose the race they started, if patience is rewarded and commitment punished, then every launch date is premature. The optimal departure year keeps receding like a horizon you'll never reach.
Which forces a harder question? Is it ever worth leaving at all?
No one who builds the ship will see the destination. No one who plans the mission will meet the people it creates. You're drafting a constitution for a nation that won't exist for 8 generations, encoding values into hull plating and rotation schedules, deciding what books and seeds and genes get carried forward into a future you can only guess at. The ethics get messier when you add up the costs. A 10,000-person ship might need $2 trillions to build, resources that could educate 500 million children or vaccinate a continent or terraform Mars. You're spending the wealth of nations on a bet that won't pay out for anyone alive today, or their grandchildren, or theirs. Every dollar you lock into that hull is a choice made for people who can't vote on it. And there's no way to test it first. You can't run a generation ship for 20 years and abort if the sociology breaks down, can't recall it if propulsion breakthroughs make it obsolete, can't evacuate if the ecosystem collapses at year 140. The commitment is absolute. You're binding people not yet born to a contract they'll never see, on a ship they didn't choose, toward a world they might not want. Because no future generation can ever agree to the journey we'd choose for them. A child born in year 340 of the voyage never asked to live in 12,000 cubic meters of rotating steel, didn't consent to the eugenics algorithms managing her gene pool, the curriculum deciding what she's allowed to know about Earth, the council determining whether she's cleared to reproduce. She inherits a world designed by the dead, with no way to leave and no memory of what was given up to put her there. Philosophers call this the non-identity problem. The people harmed by your decision wouldn't exist without it, so can they claim harm? If you hadn't launched the ship, they'd never be born to object. But if you do launch it, they're born into constraints no society on Earth would tolerate, sentenced to a life they didn't choose by ancestors they'll never meet. Their existence doesn't justify their captivity. Some mission designers argue the shipborn aren't captive because they'll know nothing else, that you can't mourn a planet you've never seen or want freedoms you've never imagined. But that's the logic of every closed system that shapes children into accepting it. The fact that indoctrination works doesn't make it ethical, and it assumes culture can be frozen, that 20 generations will believe what the first one programmed them to believe, that no one will ever look at the stars and ask why they're not allowed to choose a different one. And even if they agreed, the voyage would change what it means to be human. Language would shift first. After 300 years isolated from Earth, vowels flatten, slang fossilizes, new words emerge for ship systems that have no terrestrial names. By generation 15, recordings of the founders sound alien. Biology follows slower, but just as surely. Lower gravity during pregnancy affects bone density across lifetimes. Radiation exposure, even shielded, accumulates mutations at a rate 40% higher than on Earth. The people who step onto the new world won't just speak differently. Their skeletons, their immune systems, their gut bacteria will have diverged. Culture becomes unrecognizable. Rituals invented to mark the halfway point become sacred. The memory of rain turns metaphorical, then mythical. Stories about Earth compress and distort, like a game of telephone played across centuries, until the arrivals wouldn't recognize the civilization that launched them. And through all of that, they're supposed to remember why they're going. The real question is whether meaning itself can last 1,000 years. Humans have kept purpose alive across deep time before. The Jewish diaspora preserved identity for 2,000 years without a homeland. Buddhist monasteries copied sutras by hand for 15 centuries. Indigenous Australians passed down oral maps and law for 65,000 years, longer than writing has existed. What they had in common was repetition, ritual, and a reason bigger than survival. The generation ship would need the same, not just a mission statement, but ceremonies, annual readings, coming-of-age oaths that link each generation to the ones before and the ones to come. It might work. Memory is fragile, but meaning is surprisingly durable when a community decides it matters. If the crew can hold on to why they're traveling, if they can make the destination real for children who will never see it, the mission survives. If they can't, the ship becomes a tomb or a prison, drifting with no one left who cares where it's going. And the strange thing is, we're already dreaming up the ships to try. Project Daedalus, designed by the British Interplanetary Society in 1978, proposed a two-stage fusion rocket to Barnard's star. 50,000 tons, unmanned, 50 years one way. Icarus, its successor study, refined the numbers and added life support concepts. Stanford Torus and O'Neill cylinders aren't just sci-fi set pieces. They're engineering proposals from the 1970s for rotating habitats 1.6 kilometers across, housing 10,000 people at 1 g artificial gravity. NASA studied them seriously. The math works.
Breakthrough Starshot, funded by Yuri Milner and Stephen Hawking, plans to send light sail probes to Alpha Centauri at 20% light speed. Not a generation ship, but proof we're working the problem. China's Tiangong station and NASA's Gateway are testbeds for closed-loop life support over years, then decades.
World-ship concepts like Ensman Starship envision 3 million-ton vessels, whole asteroids hollowed out and spun, carrying 200,000 people for journeys measured in millennia. The designs exist. The blueprints are drawn. But before any of it is possible, some hard problems remain unsolved. Propulsion first. No existing engine can push 10,000 tons to even 10% light speed and sustain it for centuries. Fusion remains theoretical at scale. Antimatter requires energy budgets we can't produce. The breakthrough Starshot laser sail works for gram-scale probes, not cities.
Then there's the ecosystem. A closed-loop life support system has never run longer than 2 years without resupply. Biosphere 2 collapsed in 8 months. The ISS dumps waste and imports food every few weeks. We don't know how to balance oxygen, nitrogen, water, and soil chemistry over decades without drift. Radiation shielding adds mass we can't launch. Cosmic rays degrade DNA at rates we can't yet predict over 30 generations. Chromosome repair mechanisms might adapt, or they might fail. We won't know until someone tries. Cryogenic suspension remains science fiction. Every organ system fails differently when frozen.
Yet the hardest component of all is one no blueprint can design. You can engineer a hull, but not a constitution. What laws govern a ship 8 light-years from any court? Who holds power when there's no territory to claim and no exit? Mutinies on 18th-century vessels lasted weeks. Here, they'd last lifetimes. Psychology fractures under containment. Antarctic winter-over teams show aggression spikes after 9 months in isolation. Submarine crews rotate out every 6. A generation ship has no rotation, no horizon, no strangers. The same 2,000 faces for 40 years. Clan formation is inevitable. So is faction. Then there's the question of purpose. The first generation chose to go. The 5th did not. What obligation do the born aboard owe to a mission they never signed? Sociology offers models but no answers. We've never isolated a population this long with this much at stake.
In the end, our imagined voyages hold up a mirror to us.
Because Earth is a generation ship, we're already aboard a closed system hurtling through space at 30 kilometers per second, recycling the same water our ancestors drank, breathing air filtered by forests we're cutting down. Our life support is failing. We're just moving too slowly to notice. The difference is we have 8 million passengers and no mission plan, no destination, no unified agreement on how to distribute resources or govern collectively. The same fractures we fear on a starship, we live with now. We just have more room to avoid each other.
A generation ship forces the question we've been postponing. How do you sustain a closed world when every decision affects people not yet born? When the air you breathe and the soil you plant depend on cooperation across decades? When there's no escape hatch, no resupply, no second chance?
Because there's a simpler truth hiding underneath all of this. Earth is a generation ship, 8 billion passengers, one closed life support system, no resupply, no backup. We're moving through space at 107,000 kilometers per hour, orbiting a star that's orbiting a galaxy. The air recycles, the water recycles. The soil feeds us what we grew in it last season. Every calorie you've ever eaten came from this ship's systems. Every breath has been through 1,000 lungs before yours. The walls are thinner than you think, just 100 kilometers of atmosphere between you and vacuum. We didn't design it, we inherited it mid-voyage, and we don't know if the destination even exists, which means every one of us is already on a voyage we never chose. So the question was never whether we could survive 1,000 years sealed inside a ship. We've been doing it for 200,000 years already. The question is whether we can learn the lesson before it's too late, whether we can stop pretending the walls are infinite, whether we can manage resources, cooperate across generations, think past our own lifespans. Because if we can't do it here, on a planet with oceans and forests and a magnetosphere, we'll never do it in a metal tube between stars. The generation ship doesn't teach us how to leave, it teaches us how to stay. It shows us what we are, stewards of systems we didn't build, ancestors to people we'll never meet, passengers together on a fragile craft. And that leaves just one thing worth sitting with tonight. No generation ship has ever launched, not one. The longest crewed mission in history was 437 days aboard Mir. Proxima Centauri b sits 4.24 light-years away, surface conditions unknown. TRAPPIST-1e is 40 light-years out. Kepler 442b, 1,200. All of them untouched, all of them waiting. We've spent 60 years talking about generation ships and 0 years building them. We've written the novels, run the simulations, argued the ethics, but the hull's still on the drawing board. Maybe that's the real answer. Maybe the generation ship is the thought experiment we needed to understand the ship we're already on. If this one got you thinking, there's more waiting. Thanks for watching.